Hey, Jay Carper here from American Torah, and I'm reading to you from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. This is one of the strangest stories in the gospel. Now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise, and do not be afraid. When they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. So like I said, this is one of the strangest stories in the Gospels. Yeshua and 3 of his disciples go up a mountain where he meets Moses and Elijah. He's transfigured momentarily, and God speaks to the disciples, telling them to hear him. And then they come back down and they go about their business. What is really going on here? I mean, clearly there must be more to it. There's really, when you look at the details of this story, this is one of the most mind-blowingly symbolic events in the Gospels, maybe in the entire New Testament. So let's look at some of the first part. After 6 days, Matthew does like to use numbers significantly. The numbers frequently mean something to Matthew, or they at least try to connect to something else. What does 6 mean here? Maybe it was literally just 6 days, and that's just how long it took. Reference to 6 days of creation, 6 being the number of man. Maybe there's something there. When they get up on the high mountain, Yeshua is transfigured and his face shone like the sun. And then Moses and Elijah appear to the disciples talking with Yeshua. Now, were Moses and Elijah really there? Did they come up from the dead to speak with Yeshua for a few minutes? I don't know. I can't imagine a reason for that, but, God does things for his own reasons. So whether or not they were really there, I think, is beside the point. The real point is that God made sure that the disciples saw this. It was important for them. All of this happened, none of this happened for Yeshua's sake. It happened for the disciples' sake, so that they could witness it. Then Peter wants to build them tabernacles. In Hebrew, that's sukkot, or a sukkah in singular. Was this happening at the Feast of Tabernacles? Again, maybe. It doesn't really say, but, that's a possibility. Maybe that's why it came into his mind. Or maybe he thought they were in for a long conference of days. And there's actually a good reason for that. Why he might think that. We'll get to that here in a minute. The fact that there are Moses and Elijah here, speaking to Yeshua in the presence of God, and then God says to the disciples, listen to him. This is Moses representing the law and Elijah representing the prophets. They are like 2 witnesses before God, the judge, and God gives his verdict. This is my son. This is the Messiah. You will listen to him because he's the prophet like Moses that Moses promised. He is both the law and the prophets. But he's more than that. We'll get to that too. So one of the thing that really brings out the significance of this story isn't the story itself, but its connection to other stories in the Bible. For example, if you go to John chapter 2, there's the story of Yeshua's first miracle at the wedding of Cana. There are a surprising number of connections between the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. At least traditionally it was on Mount Tabor. I don't think it actually says that in the text anywhere. There is a connection between the Transfiguration on the mountain and the wedding at Cana, which happened to be in a valley at the foot of Mount Tabor. Let me go through those connections. First, The Transfiguration happened after a period of 6 days. They walk for 6 days, they get to the mountain. The wedding at Cana happened after a period of 3 days. They walk for 3 days and they get there. Yeshua at the mountain appears with his disciples. He goes up the mountain with his disciples, and then he goes on ahead a bit. At least that's the way the text reads. At the wedding, Yeshua comes with Mary and apparently his brothers and the disciples. As I said, the Transfiguration was at Mount Tabor. The wedding was at the valley of Cana, near Mount Tabor. At the mountain, God says, listen to him. At the wedding, Mary says, listen to him. At the mountain, Yeshua is changed. At the wedding, the wine is changed by Yeshua. On the mountain, we witness the glory of God appears in a bright light, in a great voice. At the wedding, we witness the glory of Yeshua. Even though all he really does is change the water to wine, it specifically says that this revealed the glory of Yeshua. On the mountain, he came back down with his disciples. At the wedding, he came back down with his mother and his brothers and disciples. After the Transfiguration, Yeshua says to the disciples, to the three who went with him, don't tell anybody. After the wedding, the disciples kept silent about his miracle there. I don't really know why. When Yeshua came down from the mountain of Transfiguration, he encounters a demon-possessed boy that the disciples were unable to heal, and he rebukes them for their lack of faith. When Yeshua leaves the wedding at Cana, he goes to the temple. He rebukes the merchants and the priests at the temple for their lack of respect for the house of God, and he drives them out. That's a lot of parallels between those two stories that don't really seem to have any real connection other than Yeshua himself. So let's go on to another connection. This one's in Exodus 24. Moses himself climbs Mount Sinai. The wind's really picking up here. I hope my phone doesn't blow away, and I hope you can hear me okay. Moses ascends Mount Sinai with the 70 elders of Israel and Aaron and Joshua. Just like Yeshua ascends Mount Tabor with his 3 disciples. Yeshua stops his disciples and he goes on further. On Mount Sinai, Moses stops the elders and he goes on further. Presumably with Joshua, but I don't think it says explicitly. Moses says, wait here while we go on, but it just says Moses went on. We just presume that Joshua went with him. At the Mountain of Transfiguration, the disciples have a vision of the prophets, Moses and Elijah. At Mount Sinai, the elders and the priests, they have a vision of God in God's throne room. On the Mountain of Transfiguration, Yeshua is transformed. He shines, and he became bright as the sun. On Sinai, Moses changed, and his face became too bright for the people to look at. On the Mountain of Transfiguration, Yeshua communes with heaven. He speaks to Moses and Elijah. They're not in heaven necessarily, they're in the grave, but they are dead, and in some way they are at least in the presence of God. And there is God there on the mountain in the cloud of glory, speaking with Yeshua and to the disciples. On Mount Sinai, God appears in a cloud with lightning and a great voice, just like on Mount Tabor, and he speaks to Moses. Yeshua and his disciples arrived at Mount Tabor after 6 days. Moses waited 6 days on Mount Sinai for God to make an appearance, and he appeared on the 7th day. At Mount Tabor, the disciples fall on their faces. At Mount Sinai, the whole nation of Israel falls on their faces. Yeshua says, don't fear. Moses comes down from the mountain and he says, don't fear. When Yeshua comes down from the mountain, again, he rebukes the disciples for the lack of faith. Moses comes down to witness the golden calf, and he rebukes all of Israel for their faithlessness to God. These parallels are so striking, they cannot possibly be an accident. They must be intended. But what are we supposed to learn from this? I think Yeshua showed all this to his disciples, and Matthew recorded it for us so that we would see Yeshua's connection to Moses and Elijah, but also his transcendence. You see, when Yeshua was on that mountain and he was speaking to Moses and Elijah, God interrupts and he says to the disciples, "This is my son, listen to him." He doesn't say this about Moses or Elijah, only about Yeshua. Moses prophesied that another would come, a prophet like unto me, he said, and you will listen to him. Exactly what God said on that mountain. Except that although Yeshua is a prophet like Moses, even to the point of doing the same things that Moses did in a different kind of way on Mount Tabor instead of on Mount Sinai, he is greater than Moses. He is a prophet. Elijah was the greatest of the prophets. And yet Yeshua is greater than Elijah. In the story of the wedding at Cana, Yeshua is greater than the very elements. He can transform water into wine. He is greater than the priests in all of the priestly service at the temple. He defends the temple. That's the priest's job. And yet Yeshua is greater than the priest because he does a better job and he takes ownership of the temple. This is my Father's house. If it's his Father's house, then it also must become his house. But these stories don't just show how Yeshua is greater than Moses and Elijah and the priests and the very elements of creation. It also shows how he's one of us. Yeshua goes to weddings. He listens to his mother. He does what she says. He helps people. He calms our fears. Yeshua is both the beginning and the end. He is the greatest and the least, all at the same time. He is God incarnate, and he is a humble servant who sacrifices his own life for our benefit. This is, although it seems like a very strange story, it really paints an amazing picture of who Yeshua is to us and who he is to all of creation, his role, his authority, and his humility, all at the same time. This is Jay Carper from American Torah. Be blessed.